Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy to bring the conversation I had with Alex Christofi. Alex is Editorial Director at Transworld Publishers. He's the author of numerous essays and reviews and short pieces that have appeared everywhere: The Guardian, New Humanist, New European, Brixton Review of Books, and many others. He is the author of 2 books, including the most recent, Cypria, A Journey to the Heart of the Mediterranean. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. We talk about Cypriot identity, what that is, why it's very complex. We talk about the Greek and Turkish involvement in Cyprus. We talk about some of the origins and mythology of Cyprus. We talk about some of the culture and some of the unique kinds of attributes of the island. Cyprus and the Bible, Islam, the Ottomans, British involvement, independence, the 74 coup d'etat, present and future of Cyprus, and many other topics. Cyprus is, from what I hear, a very, very beautiful place. I see friends and people that have gone there and all their pictures they post and so many wonderful things about the island. And I wanted to get there myself, and hopefully I will in the future. Alex was wonderful to talk to. Really, really, really nice to get a kind of good history of the island in one place. The book is fantastic. And so it really, really was nice to talk a little bit about Cyprus, which we don't hear enough about. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so like, subscribe, share with your friends. And now I bring you Alex Christofi. I am here with Alex Christofi. Alex, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. You have out an awesome book. The book is called Cypria, A Journey to the Heart of the Mediterranean, and it is about the island and country of Cyprus. So I'm very excited to talk all about Cyprus. Before we do, why don't you tell listeners who you are professionally and how you came to write the book and any other relevant details.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a writer and editor. I work. I have a day job as a book publisher. So I publish others' nonfiction on history and various other topics. And in that time, I've also been writing books. So I started out as a novelist, really. I wrote a couple of novels, and I think over time, my kind of writing and editing worlds have kind of converged a little bit. So I started writing nonfiction. I wrote a previous book, which was kind of a passion project in a different way to this one, which was about Dostoevsky. I just set myself a challenge to read all of his works, and I realized as I was reading them that he has this amazingly kind of autobiographical moments littered throughout his fiction. And I also found out that he wanted to write a memoir. So I thought it would be a fun exercise to see how much of it I could kind of join up and almost as a reconstructive memoir. So that was the previous project. And then the project that's always been kind of in my back of my mind, I always wanted to write a book about Cyprus, which is where my dad's from. He came to the UK where I live when he was about 7 or 8 in the early 60s. And, he's very proudly Cypriot. But there have been all these things growing up that people would kind of refer to in the way that when things are very fresh in memory, kind of, particularly when it comes to conflict, people don't necessarily want to feel they're kind of raking over these difficult moments in recent history. So I always had all these questions in my mind about why exactly Cyprus is divided, why there seems to be this kind of embittered conflict between the communities that live there. And I kind of found out more over the years, but I really wanted to give myself the time and space to piece it all together. And amazingly, there isn't really a modern, up-to-date history of the island. There are some very good books which deal with the 50s campaign for independence, or for Enosis, which was the Cypriot people who wanted to be joined as part of Greece. And there's some very good books on the conflict that happened in 1974, which was what led to the division of the island. But not very much that kind of covers everything. And actually, there's so much to say about the 20th century. People kind of miss all this really interesting stuff about the ancient history.
That's interesting. In some ways, they're while you wouldn't think so on the surface of it, but there is a sort of overlap between the two projects, right? Like kind of seeing this sort of autobiographical piece of Dostoevsky, which I've also read all of his stuff, and he's one of my favorite writers. He's fantastic. But then kind of doing it, I guess, a bit for yourself, of trying to find some of your own history and piecing together some things, which is really, really cool. It's a way in which you probably wouldn't. So, and probably in some ways, the other project probably was in some ways helpful for doing this one. I would think in some ways of maybe how you pieced it together, or how you were connecting threads, or things like that, which is cool because in the book you see elements of that. You'll kind of talk a little bit of some memories or things about Cyprus, and your experiences, and then talk about as a kind of jumping off point for whatever point in history that is, which is also really cool because it makes it feel kind of more current and relevant, not just like 3,000 years ago, and so kind of just some of the data like that, which is really nice. It's very, very nice.
Oh, great. Yeah, it felt like it is, in some ways it always feels, I think probably for anywhere that someone knows well, but to me it feels kind of particularly for Cyprus like the history is this thing that we're still living with. There's so much of the history that you just turn a corner in a road and encounter it. The obvious, very kind of famous example is that Nicosia is the capital of Cyprus. It's the last physically divided capital in the world. So some roads you literally just reach a point at the end of the road, and there's a barrier with a checkpoint where you have to get your passport seen, and in order to progress through the city, because there's a kind of UN buffer zone that's separating these two communities in North and South Cyprus.
Yeah, that's right. I knew loosely a few things about Cyprus, 74 coup d'etat, I knew that's, divided, and, a few other things. But, really reading the book was, it's like, oh my goodness, like, there's some wild stuff there. It's like, it's, how do people not, I guess, talk about this more than maybe how they should. So, okay, Cyprus. I mean, as we've kind of been already getting into, it's deeply fascinating. I haven't been there. I would love to go. I hear it's a beautiful place. I've known a few people that have gone there and say it's, kind of magical in some ways. I guess the question that you don't really, tackle or answer kind of directly, and I can see totally why. But I guess the question is what does it mean, to be Cypriot? Like what is a person that's Cypriot? You talk about throughout the book in kind of a cursory way. It's not like a strict history book, but there's so many different people groups on the island throughout thousands of years: Mycenaeans, Phoenicians, Assyrians, Persians, Egyptians, Romans, Umayyads, Abbasids, Templars, French, Venetians, Ottomans, and the British. I left a few out there. There's so much original on such a small piece of land in the Mediterranean. And then, as you mentioned, more recently, it's really kind of three-ish of sorts. You got the Turks, the Turkish folks there. You got the Greek folk there, and then you also have some British folks there as well. And that's usually probably from the more modern pieces of things. So when people say I'm Cypriot, like what is it? Do people make that distinction of like, well, I'm Turkish Cypriot, I'm Greek Cypriot, I'm British, or are there other smaller ethnicities? Like, is it really that divided that people make that distinction, or what does it mean? Is it more of a connection, nationality that doesn't seem right? It's maybe not ethnic group? What does it mean? I guess maybe it's a hard question, but
it is a hard question, and it kind of gets to the part. it sort of goes to the heart of why I wrote the book, because there are these kind of competing histories of Cyprus. So there are those who say that it was always, I mean, it's always been majority, kind of almost always been majority Greek speaking since about 3,000 years ago. So about 80% of the island in modern times would be Greek speaking. Many of them would then align themselves with a kind of broader idea of Greek identity, Greek culture, the kind of what Greeks in the 20th century would have called the megali idea, the big idea, or the grand idea in a way, of an expansive Greek identity that crossed the Mediterranean, which, that kind of overlaps with a sort of Byzantine idea of what it is to be Greek. The almost like the second Rome in a way, like you see Romans and Greeks used interchangeably for several hundred years. So there's that idea. There's the mainly Ottoman holdover. Islam arrived really early, almost as soon as Islam began.
Yeah,
there was an Islamic presence on the island, but there was a much stronger Islamic presence from the Ottoman siege of the island in 1571. So for about 300 years, it was an Ottoman. It kept changing what the term was used, but it was basically a kind of a province of the Ottoman Empire. So I think when you start kind of, either you take the view that it has to, because it's this, it can't be this. And for me, in a place like Cyprus, that immediately problematizes identity. Or you see it as being something that's essentially additive. Of course, it has this very rich Ottoman history to draw on, and it was Byzantine, and actually it was, amazingly, it was held in condominium for a couple of hundred years between the Byzantine and the Arabic empires of the time in about 700 AD. So it's a kind of it's always been this hybrid entity. I think the reason why I thought it kind of feels important to write a sort of Cypro-centric history of Cyprus is that there are only really up to now histories of Cyprus written from the view of Britain or from the view of Greek historians, or there isn't actually. I'm talking about within the English language, obviously, that there are Cypriot scholars and have been for a while. In the English language, there's very, very little Cypriot history written by Cypriots, which is stunning, really.
I guess, I mean, what is it was if I recall this correctly. So the in the modern period, Turkey had some control, I guess, over the land, or it was part of their what's it called? Not empire, but they had some kind of say to it, I guess. But Greece never did. Like modern Greece, post revolution, after they had independence, never did. And so if it's interesting how there's so many Greek-speaking folks there, and maybe in terms of very long history past, but it's interesting because I mean, I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but there starts to become like all of this like fighting, like who owns it, who has it, right? Is it the Turks? Is it the Greeks? Britain's sort of kind of in the middle there of sorts, like, but they start fighting over this, and even till now, I mean, I think Cyprus is technically independent; it's part of the EU, but you still have the Turkish government and the Greek government still trying to say like who gets more ownership of, or who gets more, because it is, divided. I mean, what's the kind of, play that? I know in the Greek Isles, I mean, it was in more recent news, I think last year, this year, where, people would like, you can't go to these isles because, the Turks are there, and then you can't go to these because the Greeks are there, and they're just it's fighting about who has it really or not. And it seems like maybe in a different way Cyprus gets in there. But yeah, I mean, what's the kind of like, there's no ownership to this, I guess, but people feel, I guess some of these countries feel they have it, like even in a modern state. What's that about?
It's a real exception, a historical exception, because uh, the what we think of now as the kind of hard set borders and boundaries of modern Greece and modern Turkey, those were set out in the Treaty of Versailles, basically at the end of World War One.
Yeah.
And World War One, we think, here in the UK, in most of Europe, people say, okay, World War One, 1914 to 1918. In the southern Europe, in the Mediterranean, it wasn't the case. It carried the war carried on for another 3 years, really, the fighting. The Greek army had pushed into mainland Anatolia, basically. This was the tail end of the Ottoman Empire. And there were some of the other great powers had kind of designs on the Ottoman Empire. Russia famously thought it was going to take Constantinople and establish a third Rome. And so the Treaty of Versailles, when after all that fallout, basically legislated this huge population swap between Muslims who were living in Greece, who were just shipped over to Anatolia. A lot of Greek speakers or Christians were shipped over to mainland Greece. And in the time leading up to that, there had been, some kind of terrible massacres on both sides, I have to say. So this is not kind of a one-sided conflict. In Crete, there was a massacre of Turkish people. There was famously the sacking of Smyrna, which was where a lot of the Greeks lived in Western Turkey. So it was designed to create this kind of clean break, basically. And it was also the thing, Turkey couldn't object to these boundaries because this was the very treaty that outlined the borders of modern Turkey. And so contesting that would be very problematic. This was also the treaty that set out that Britain got to keep Cyprus. They'd actually basically been renting it. It was a kind of protectorate. And from 1878, Benjamin Disraeli, who was he made a kind of sneaky deal where he agreed to defend Turkey from Russia, I should say the Ottoman Empire from Russia, as long as he got Cyprus in return, and he'd have to give it back if Russia started attacking Turkey again. But he'd actually made a separate agreement with Russia that they wouldn't attack Turkey, so he knew they wouldn't, and he'd get to keep Cyprus. They were renting it and kind of administering it technically on behalf of the Ottoman Empire, but they gave up all pretense during World War One. They offered it to Greece in return for Greece joining the fighting on the Allies' side, and it was turned down for complicated reasons. They had their own stuff going on. So it was kind of trapped in this weird limbo situation where it wasn't part of the negotiations of, okay, this is definitively Turkish, okay, this is definitively Greek, and there were no population swaps, and conspicuously there was very, very little ethnic violence until pretty much after World War II. So one of the arguments I make in the book is that kind of intercommunal violence was stoked initially by a British administration that was trying to hold on. And obviously, I don't think they would have wanted or predicted how badly it got, but it was the Brits who started that.
Yeah, it does feel almost like it's like you get a third party involved, and they just like kind of disrupt things, maybe unintentionally, but it's just like, yeah, you're meddling here, and you're you're making a kind of a mess of things, and that also is how it reads in the book. It's like, yeah, I don't really understand all this. It's unfortunate because I feel like you hear much of the region, in the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean. A lot of the stuff we see today, you didn't see that all the time. You did see people able to kind of cohabitate together, different religions, Christians, Muslims, different ethnic groups. And I don't know, maybe because of the wars, World War I, World War II. I'm not sure, but in the mid 20th century till present, you just see so much like conflict and racism, and you see all these like awful things. And that's not to say it never happened before. Of course it did, but there is a difference. I feel like mid
Yeah,
20th
there's
century
been
into
a
now.
decline in these kind of melting pots, particularly
Yeah,
melting cities like Smyrna,
yeah.
but also like Alexandria, somewhere like
Hmm.
that,
Hmm.
which was very, very cosmopolitan. I think some of it has been the kind of hardening of national boundaries in general,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
the kind of increasing use of a passport system
Hmm.
and the sort of securitization of borders. So I think it's partly that. I think it's partly sad to say, I think a lot of the places where the conflict has been the worst share something in common. You've got obviously terrible conflict in Israel and Palestine to this day.
Hmm.
You have Cyprus, you have Ireland, the conflicts that there have been between India and Pakistan. These were places that were ruled by the British,
Yeah.
and there was a kind of divide and rule
Hmm.
policy.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. So, in understanding, I guess the dynamics of Cyprus, if we go all the way back, I mean, it must have been really tough trying to kind of get like an origins. Like, where does the island start, right? Now, you don't go all the way back geologically. Like, well, it's a volcanic, or from certain parts, it formed here out of the sea. But you do make the distinction in sort of the beginning of the book of why the sea is super important. I mean, maybe that kind of feels obvious to people because it's an island, but more so, I took it in the terms of like in the region, you do have at the time, 3,000 years ago, trade. Like trade is super important. How people are moving across the Mediterranean, and Cyprus in some ways seems to be at the very least a really good stopping point. You start to see people that start to bring things, and of course, if you bring trade, you're also bringing language, you're bringing culture, you're bringing different ideas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, so yeah, you tell us about how the sea is important to, and also mythology. I'll ask you
Yeah.
about the prequel in a minute, which I didn't know that, which was really cool. So yeah, I guess tell us about like kind of the earliest origins of Cyprus in myth, maybe, but also where we start to see it in history. Like where do we kind of see it kind of really really form in kind of the human mind, or documenting it at the very least.
So the thing that I think is really interesting about islands is that if they're really, really far out, then they're purely places of isolation. You get some amazing phenomena that happen on islands ecologically. One of the things I thought was a kind of almost makes for an interesting metaphor is you get some of these species that evolved on Cyprus that were basically completely distinct from all other species because they were kind of cut off from the rest. So in some ways, islands are these places that have to form their own identity, their own kind of community that is inward looking.
Mm.
One of the ways this shows up in myths is that you get these Cyclops myths and lots of Cyclops caves and things, and you find these big old bones, these big, huge skulls, actually in Cyprus because you get this phenomenon called insular dwarfing.
Mm.
All of the really big species just get smaller. So the Cyclops in Cyprus is quite little and cute.
Mhm.
And but nevertheless, they had these bulbous skulls
Mm.
with a big central socket, which people would have presumed was where this one big gigantic central eye would have gone. And we now know that those skulls are elephant skulls. The gap was for a trunk. But this is the way that these things were sort of coded into our reality, the reality we were really living in many thousands of years ago, before history was really written down. So you've got to hold in your head the fact that there's this kind of autochthonous or sort of indigenous sense of identity that's coming from an island.
Mm.
But when islands are close to mainland, or like many of the great trading empires are, like Britain, or somewhere like Japan, or bits of Greece where you get these amazing ports, and of course Greece is one of the biggest shipping companies in the world in the modern era.
Mhm.
Cyprus is at this sort of crossing point for many of the earliest civilizations. So it really benefits from that kind of interchange. What's so interesting to me is that it's kind of a combination of having its own, it's kind of got its own thing going on, but it's also constantly being kind of challenged and provoked and encountering new ideas, encountering new cultures through these trading relationships. So Aphrodite, the myth of Aphrodite's birth, everyone remembers the kind of, it was certainly shocking for men, where Cronus gets his testicles cut off with a scythe, they're thrown in the sea, and the froth of the semen washes up on the shore of Cyprus, and that's Aphrodite. Literally means kind of foam born. She's born out of that foam on the shores of Paphos. But what's really interesting to me is that she's literally the meeting point of the sea and the shore. She's born from the marriage of Uranos, the sky, and Gaia, the earth. So it's this kind of meeting point, really. That's Aphrodite, which is the kind of goddess who rules over Cyprus, is all about this interchange. And of course, as a metaphor, interchange is these kind of crossing points, and blending and hybridizing is all about sex, which is the god of love.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, you really just see these things are about relationships or connections to things, right? Which is super, super interesting. The relationship with sea and land, the relationship between people, the relationship between different ways of understanding history. Tell us about this Cypria, right? Is I'm saying this right? The prequel to the Iliad, which is interesting. Some people might not know this. I didn't really know this either. Many people are familiar with the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, but apparently there was some precursor to this. Tell us about this. But just as a larger point of again how much and how important it is that the idea of myth is really important to Cyprus as almost I would say as its I guess as the island's identity of sorts. It's really a big kind of identity mark in some way. Yeah, tell us about this.
Yeah, it's really tantalizing because we do have some of it now, but we know that it had books and books. It basically told you a kind of cycle of all of the myths that led up to the Trojan War. Famously, at the start of the Iliad, you arrive in like the 9th year. So you're kind of stuck in medias res, and they're all quite tired, and Achilles is being grumpy, and you have to kind of catch up. The Cypriot was basically telling you all of the myths that led to this kind of present strife. And we only have a few fragments, one of which is that of Aphrodite walking ashore and being kind of surrounded by flowers and perfumes and things. We do know from reports of contemporaneous writers some of the things that were in it, which we don't now have as a primary source. So one of these things, which I think is kind of amazing, is this idea that Zeus felt that humans were kind of overburdening the land. There were just too many humans, and in his kind of grander top-level wisdom, he decided to sort of decimate the human population in order to kind of give the land some breathing room. It's this sort of apocalyptic. I mean, it reminds me. It's kind of like Thanos, basically, from Marvel.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
But it's an amazing kind of believable, slightly dystopian in the present day with all our fears about climate change. Aristotle famously said about the Cypria that, with something like the Iliad, you could write one tragedy. With the Odyssey, you could write a tragedy. But if you were going to write a play based on the Cypria, you could write dozens. There are so many stories in it. So it does seem to have held a lot of importance for ancient writers. And it seems to indicate that Cyprus was a site of production of Greek culture. I think sometimes it's said that, mainland Greece, the Balkans, are where Greece resides, and the Greek people. many Mycenaean refugees after this Bronze Age collapse. We know that they settled in Cyprus. We know they were writing Greek, but in the Cypriot script, because they seem to have killed all their scribes. There seems to have been some kind of civil war. And so I think it's important in setting up all of these kind of later questions of identity to note that a lot of what we would now think of as this kind of almost like the epitome of Greek culture, a lot of the production of culture was going on in Cyprus as well. So it's not necessarily peripheral to ancient Greek identity in the way that we might suppose.
Yeah, it's really, really, really interesting. So one of the things that you do nicely in the book is you give us sort of, I guess, flavors of things about I guess you could say the uniqueness of it, right? The uniqueness of the island. One of the things you talk about early on is this idea of olive culture, right? With the trees and all these things. And again, for listeners like myself, I've some listeners may have, but I haven't been to Cyprus. So tell us about this olive culture and what it's like and the trees and all. How is this instantiated there, and what is that like?
It's I mean, you can't avoid. It's not that Cyprus owns all the olive trees. Of course, they've really widely spread around the Mediterranean, all the way as far as France, and lots of people. The Spanish will claim they've got the best olive oil. So will the Italians. So it's not a monopoly, but it seems that olives were first domesticated around the kind of Eastern Mediterranean, probably roughly where Jordan is today. And initially, because they love being pruned, so they grow back really quickly. They grow back even thicker the next year, so they're kind of an endless source of wood. So probably they were used for wood at first, then the fruits were picked and eventually kind of actively cultivated to produce a better fruit. But the thing that's really interesting about it from a historical perspective is that you can cultivate olives on land that isn't used for other arable crops. Rocky, hilly places that are no good for wheat or oats or barley or any of those sort of cereal crops, suddenly you can make that land productive. And a famous archaeologist called Colin Renfrew a few decades ago estimated that the increase in production that you would get from cultivating olives in that area is something like 40% of the total. It's so large that you suddenly find you get a surplus. Once you have a surplus, there's only so many olives you can. I mean, I don't personally believe this, but I'm told there's only so many olives you can eat. And so you want to trade, my olives for your wheat. And once you've got trade, then you've got these kind of networks of exchange. And that process of hybridization is really what leads to complex societies. So even by 3,000 years ago, you had this amazing network of which Cyprus was kind of in the middle, trading certainly olives, but also trading precious metals. We think of the Bronze Age as this thing where, in relative terms, it kind of wasn't that sophisticated. To make bronze, you need 9 parts copper and 1 part tin or thereabouts. And so that requires trade. Civilization is trade, it's hybridization. And Cyprus was at the heart of it because they had all the copper, which is what you need to power the Bronze Age, basically. So it's, it places, when you think of it in these terms, it places Cyprus in a much more central position than most historians would put it. You have Bronze Age kings of Cyprus like writing to the Pharaoh of Egypt as my brother. And then when other local empires write to them and they have to call the king of Cyprus father because he's sort of further up the hierarchy than them.
Yeah. You also mentioned the royal purple that's made from the shellfish. This is interesting. Tell us about this. What is this all about?
Yeah, so you've probably heard of the Phoenicians, the ancient Phoenicians who come from what's now Lebanon. Phoenicians is basically a Greek word that just means the purple ones. Their reputation for being really, really good dyers of cloth preceded them. So they just got known by the fact that they had this really good purple dye. And it's kind of hard to put yourself in the mentality in the present day when industrial techniques are so efficient.
Yeah.
But this was extremely expensive. It was seen as being a very, very limited production. And it required, the purple dye came from these little snails, basically, sea snails, that only live in certain parts around Lebanon, but also around the coast of Cyprus. So the Phoenicians established an early trading post in Cyprus called Kition or Kitty. It's now Larnaca. So it's one of the most, the longest continuously inhabited cities. It's been going for well over 3,000 years. And they got rich off of this. It was, again, it complicates this idea of Cyprus as being purely, let's say, a Greek island, because actually you had city-states. Some of them would be kind of Mycenaean Greeks. Some of them would be actually just a bunch of Cypriots who'd always lived there. And some of them would be Phoenicians. So these were sort of not necessarily warring states, but they were competitive. They weren't all joined up into one kind of unified kingdom. There were about 10 different kingdoms at this time. And the Phoenicians, a lot of their history was kind of written by the Greeks who hated them because they were their main rivals. So we don't have a lot of very kind of fawning coverage of the Phoenicians in the way that you do of ancient Greeks. But we do know that they were really, we know just from the archaeology that they were incredibly commercially successful. I think probably their cultural influence was underestimated, having brought the precursor to the modern alphabet to the Mediterranean, the dye trading, which was so important to textile production. And I point out in my book one of the most famous philosophers of all time, Zeno of Citium. He grew up in Cyprus. He was a rich merchant.
I didn't know all this. I know who he is, but I didn't know he was from Cyprus. I was like, oh, I was not expecting that. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's I think because a word like Kitian doesn't really mean that much to most people unless you study ancient history. It kind of passes you by a bit. And all of the famous stories about him are like, once he basically got shipwrecked and ended up in Athens and was sat in a bookshop trying to figure out what to do next. And someone pointed out a famous philosopher, so he went and followed him. And eventually he founded the Stoic school of philosophy, which has still got many adherents today. But it was because they would walk up and down this painted stoa. It was like a corridor, kind of like the equivalent of a shopping mall, really. It's a weird place to philosophize, but that was where they did it. And he was just the most popular. His philosophy was incredibly influential.
Yeah, it's interesting to see, some of his origins. It's like, oh yeah, it's all the story is interesting, kind of by happenstance. But knowing these things about Cyprus a little bit, it's like, yeah, that impact, that impact of your outlook on life, and you're doing all this type of philosophy. There's obviously some impact there. Some people.
I quite like.
Go ahead.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say I quite like the pre-Stoicism Zeno. Actually, seemed quite chill. So when he was just a Cypriot merchant, his main activities that he liked were just like sunbathing and eating figs. I've got to think like. That's kind of a nice philosophy too.
That's kind of a nice way of living as well. I mean, you can't beat that.
Yeah, the road not traveled.
So some people might know this story. This was familiar for me. It's in I think I can't remember exactly, but it's in the book of Acts in the Bible. It's like middle to end of Acts. Acts has 28 chapters, so it might be in the 20s there or something like that. But there's this story of Paul and Barnabas, and people might know this story if went to Sunday school or they were raised somewhat quasi Christian, and they end up at Paphos, right? And so there's like, I don't know, reading how you were talking about it in the book was really cool, because it was like, well, I know like the quote unquote the true story as told in the book of Acts in the Bible. But it's like, it's cool to like get outside of that and just see like kind of a little bit more of what that's like. So yeah, I mean, is there I guess like historical accounts or ideas that like, yeah, there are at least two guys that came over here and they, spread a little bit of Christianity and proselytize people and all that stuff. I mean, what is there
Yeah.
some kind of truth to some of those things, or yeah, how do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really difficult with scripture to disentangle what kind of needs to be. I mean, looking at it from a secular atheist perspective,
Hmm.
trying to sort of put the historian hat on.
Yep.
So, regardless of whether you have faith in Christianity,
Hmm.
if you take the historicist perspective, then you try to look at what was written when, and what seems to be corroboratable by what we do know from
Hmm.
outside sources. And then the later you get, the more you tend to think as a historian that what's getting written is what kind of needs to be true in
Hmm.
order for the story to be coherent, or to make sense of things that don't seem to make sense. So Luke was one of the earlier of the Gospels,
Hmm.
and it does seem to kind of line up quite well with the little else that is known, of his lifetime immediately after Jesus' death. So it's a really good source, and there's not that many periods, or places in that time period, where I should say, where we have multiple accounts. Very often what's held up as being the gold standard of history, we might literally just have 200 words from Herodotus, and we have to take it as
Hmm.
the best we're ever going to know,
Hmm.
unless maybe something they managed to X-ray something from Herculaneum, using AI and
Right.
uncover a new source. But so Luke, Luke at times is not perfect, but I think it's kind of a good basis for trying to get a sense of the feel of the time, what it was like in this sort of bizarre aftermath of the Messiah was supposed to bring back, in the literal sense, was supposed to bring back the kingdom of God,
Hmm.
which most people at the time thought meant, grab a sword and like physically establish the kingdom
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
God.
Right. Right. Right.
And so when he was after he was crucified, there was this period of soul searching, and there were these two main factions, one based in Jerusalem, and it was really Paul that had the innovation to see that, the interpretations that we have today in modern Christianity of Jesus as having given his life as a way of kind of redeeming the rest of us.
Hmm.
This was a kind of a Pauline interpretation, and it was mainly Greeks. They were mainly based in Antioch,
Hmm.
and Christians comes from, Christos. It was the kind of Greek language version that was taught in Antioch, which is only 60 miles from Cyprus.
Mm.
So the guy who the head office had sent, a Greek Jew who they trusted, he was actually Cypriot Greek
Mm.
Jew, called Barnabas, and he was supposed to be supervising them in Antioch. And so Barnabas and Paul went out on their missions. The first mission, they traveled overseas, and they went to one of the famously godless places, which is the site of Aphrodite's worship in Paphos.
Mm.
And so they were going to kind of strike at the heart of paganism, basically at the heart of
Hmm.
some of these apparently depraved traditions. And it's presented in Luke as being a kind of, they're irresistible, basically. But you do see other hints, actually, that they're having to kind of stand and argue in the squares
Hmm.
with Stoics.
Hmm.
A lot of people aren't going to let go of their Stoicism easily.
Hmm.
There are some people who find them very persuasive, but can only interpret them in this kind of syncretist way, as like, oh, so Barnabas must be an incarnation of Zeus, and Paul must be an incarnation of Hermes, because there's no other kind of framework for
Hmm.
them to understand what these two are saying.
Hmm.
Um, so it's easy in hindsight to think like, oh, they just turn up and say, Jesus is the guy, and everyone's like, yeah, cool.
Hmm.
There was a period of argumentation,
Yeah.
and obviously Paul spent a lot of his time locked up.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah. A long time ago, I was a kind of a fundamentalist Christian, and so now
Mm.
it's a secular humanist, atheist. It's again, it's kind of the same thing. I read it one way, so reading the story a different way is always cool because it's like, oh, you get that different perspective, and it is interesting to see, yeah, like that story of like, oh yeah, when you're thinking about it, just more, less of the like kind of religious spiritual context and more just kind of the like practical. It's like, oh, like this was that close to Cyprus, and oh, he was actually from there. Oh, and then you start seeing it a little bit differently, and it is interesting to think about if people had not only just like it's not just a belief system, right? Like as we talked about earlier, like if there's some element of like identity with call it quote unquote paganism, yeah, two guys, coming from well, I guess Paul was from southeastern Turkey, and I
Yeah.
guess Barnabas would be a sort of a kind of a local. But either way, is spending time in Palestine and in Israel. I guess it would be kind of like, hey, who are these two guys? Like like
Yeah.
this is cool. Like you like the guy that isn't here anymore, and that's cool. But like we have this like not only do we have this belief system, but like we have like this is our tradition. This is part of like sort of like our identity. Like that would be pretty hard to kind of just give up because two dudes came in. We're like, yeah, not so true.
Yeah. Well, Barnabas did a second trip on his own. He fell out with Paul and then
Mhm.
decided to go back to Cyprus on his own to continue the good work, the gospel, the good news.
Right.
And so he went back to his hometown in Salamis and tried again to preach to the Salaminians. There were a lot of Salaminian Jews, and they just pretty clearly thought he was. I mean, he matched the textbook definition of a heretic, so they stoned him to death. And that was his hometown.
Yeah.
So it wasn't an easy conversion process, at least initially.
Yeah, it's very, very fascinating. So we mentioned it earlier, so we don't have to take a long time with it, but yeah, the spread of Islam. So I've always said that out of the big three, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Islam is the new kid on the block still. So 7th century,
Yeah.
which isn't it's a long time ago, but it's younger than Christianity and younger than Judaism. So and that story I've talked about it, the history of different aspects of the history of Islam here on the podcast. So, but it's interesting how it has a kind of meteoric rise of sorts, and during a period which is really interesting. Of course, you have Umayyad and Abbasid dynasties, and then you have other dynasties subsequently. But it's interesting how you mentioned it. I think in the beginning that Islam kind of comes to Cyprus pretty quickly. As you have the rise, Prophet Muhammad, middle of the 7th century. Okay, he shortly dies. You have the whole thing about succession, but yeah, Islam makes it there. What was it that I guess people took to it, or they were like, oh yeah, like this new kind of idea at the time, and yeah, I guess what's the impact of Islam on Cyprus?
Yeah, I mean, it famously spread really quickly through the Arabic Peninsula, and I think you could point to historical reasons why there was a kind of power vacuum in that area, and there were certain kind of contingent reasons why it might have spread quickly in the lifetime of Muhammad.
Yeah.
But I think it's also important to remember that in the same way as Christianity was at first seen as a kind of radical branch of Judaism, we now see it as a sort of separate religion in our heads. We kind of categorize them differently. Islam is an Abrahamic faith as well, and so it's also it was seen as a kind of a sect of this recognized set of religious practices and beliefs. Maybe there were different rituals. Obviously, the Muslims believe that some of those new rules and rituals were revealed directly by Allah, and so they might follow different practices, but no one disputes it's the same God. And for a long time, a lot of Orthodox Christians felt they had much more sympathy with Muslims than they did with Catholic Christians. So we have to kind of keep that in our head a little bit when we talk about the spread of early Islam. Famously there was the kind of iconomachy when there were no allowed icons in Orthodox churches for a little while in like the I'm going to get rusty on this, eight or 900s, I think that there was the iconography. But that was very influenced by Islamic scholars. So they were looking at some of the scriptural interpretation of Islam and building it into orthodoxy. So there was a kind of the boundaries were maybe a bit more porous than we might think they are today. But it was also a contested sort of. It was a kind of front line with of the Byzantine Empire. It was never a particularly strongly held position for the Byzantine Empire. They had other areas where there were kind of greater concentration of forces. So it was always this kind of borderland, really. I think that's pretty clear when you see the fact that the two sort of sides, these two empires were willing to hold it in condominium and share taxes. It kind of wasn't worth the effort. I found a little note that Harun al-Rashid actually managed to land in Cyprus during his lifetime, and I never managed to find any information on it. That was one of the few things I was kind of sad not to be able to include in the book. But yeah, there's a lovely story that basically a kind of aunt figure of Muhammad who had often hosted him for dinners at her house, who had kind of provided for him where he had slept as a guest in her house and was very close to her. She was actually there along with this kind of first wave of conquerors in about 15, 16 years after Muhammad died. So it was the first naval success in Islam. And they landed initially in the east. They kind of pushed on towards where Larnaca is now. And she fell off her donkey and hit her head and died. And that became one of the most holy mosques in Europe. There was a shrine, initially a shrine, and about 300 or 400 years ago during the Ottoman time, about 300 years ago during Ottoman period, the Hala Sultan Tekke, it's called. There's a mosque which is on this kind of beautiful oasis with a salt lake, and it's still used as a site of worship today, despite being in the south, which is the sort of nominally Christian or Greek part.
Interesting. Yes, this is a really, I think, even today, even if you have people that are, if you see Christians and Muslims interact, even though they have currently today stark differences in things, you do get a sense of like, hey, I could totally disagree with you, but there's mostly, I mean, obviously there are many people that, are around the world fighting each other for religious beliefs. So I'm not trying to downplay that. But I do think in a lot of places, the optimist view here is what I'm saying is people have a reverence and respect for that. It's like, you know what? Yeah, like I think you're wrong or whatever. You're going to hell, but hey, that's your thing. And I do see that a lot. I mean, of course, you do see the inverse of that, where people are going to literally kill each other because of it. But I do think in a lot of places, it's nice to see people have reverence for things that are important to them. So
yeah.
Okay, so there's the interesting period. You have a little bit of the Crusaders there in Cyprus. You get to the Venetians, and then you finally get to the Ottomans. So there's obviously this kind of Middle Ages of sorts. The question I have here is, so it becomes, I guess, relevant or important for kind of modern times. I mean, of course, the Ottoman Empire was 600 years continuously, all the way up to World War I is where it ended, and even late. People used to talk about early, middle, late Ottoman, but even post Ottoman, 1920 till the 40s or 50s, you still see the kind of shadow of the Ottomans. A lot of these, nation states that are created basically take a lot of the Ottoman legal system and administration, and they just kind of plug and play of sorts. It doesn't always work, of course, but it's interesting. What is the biggest, I guess, or some of the impacts that the Ottomans and the Turkish, I guess, subsequently had on Cyprus, is in terms of the linens, in terms of the food, in terms of the culture, in terms of the language? Like, what's the impact of Ottoman and then Turkish kind of rule on the island?
Yeah, it wasn't. So there's a kind of received narrative about the Ottoman period in Cyprus, which is basically that it was a time of of terrible poverty and strife, and nothing good happened. So the really short version is like there were a lot of plagues involving locusts and stuff. There was some bad harvests that involved famine, and part of that was because of a kind of a quite oppressive system of taxation, which meant there basically wasn't enough for the people living there to subsist. A lot of the bad stuff, and this is, I'm not saying that none of this is true, because the kind of core of it is true, which is that they sort of for a long time rented out the governorship of the island to the highest bidder, and your tenancy would only really be maybe a year. And so if I've paid crazy money to get this position, I don't really have any long-term loyalty to the island. It basically, the only way to recoup my costs is to extract as much as humanly possible in that 1 year. It's a system of bad incentive, or what we would call perverse incentives, in kind of modern economist speak. So it was basically badly administered, and that led to a lot of uprisings. I think the kind of crude idea would be that the sort of oppressed Greeks were revolting against the sort of evil elite Turkish or Ottoman rulers. It was a bit more complicated than that, because actually some of the uprisings were led by Turkish Cypriots, or led by Janissaries. There was a band of Ottoman Turks who arrived and said they were Janissaries, but then they turned out they weren't Janissaries. They were just trying to like tie everyone up and steal their money, which is a grand age of piracy. So I kind of get it, but they got found out and killed. So the one kind of one moment in the Ottoman period that is very kind of noteworthy is that during the beginning of the Greek War of Independence, so 1821, all of the places that the Ottoman Empire was very scared that they would lose territory to these uprisings. Obviously, Greece in the end did become independent, but in 1821 there were some sort of organization efforts going on through the Greek Orthodox Church, and they were quite brutally quashed by a massacre of basically almost all of the prominent Greek Cypriots on the island. So the priest class, but also the elite kind of secular, merchants and things like that. There were several hundred who were massacred in 1821. So this is a kind of version of the Cypriot history, which obviously emphasizes a feeling of sort of conflict, and I think what it underplays is the fact that actually there was remarkably little what we would think of now as intercommunal violence. So in like a mixed Greek and Turkish village, it wasn't as if they were kind of constantly at war with one another because of their cultures, practices, beliefs. Actually, mostly they were being quite neighborly. You'd have Muslim Cypriots going to the Greek wedding of their Christian neighbors or whatever. It was quite respectful, and it was well mixed and well integrated. So it doesn't seem to have been a kind of ethnic hatred at all. And actually, when you look at the cultural stuff, there's not a huge amount of written sources, and so that's part of what allows people to make these kind of big claims for their version of history. They're kind of writing into this vacuum. There probably are more Ottoman sources than have been exposed, but they'll be in the archives in Turkey, and they'll be written in Turkish in the Arabic script, and so there's very few people who can read those. So we have to read other things. If you look at the kind of the architecture, the heritage of Islam in Cyprus, which had a very kind of Sufi tradition, whirling dervishes and things like that. The kind of food heritage. Obviously, the Ottoman was, it was an Islamic empire, but it was also a major trading empire. It became rich off of its incredible overland trade, and it only really declined because of the sea trade of the Atlantic empires. So you had amazing kind of movements of culture across the Ottoman Empire. And many of the things that we think of as quintessentially Cypriot today, I can't imagine not having the gafeneon, where you go and get your lovely, unfiltered, powdery, we would call it Cypriot coffee. Some people would say Greek coffee. It was brought by the Ottomans, It started in Yemen. I think there were probably some very high goats. And then the farmers noticed and got in on the action, and it spread. From about 1500, it was in Istanbul. From about the kind of late 1500s, it was already in Cyprus. And people in London and Oxford managed to get their hands on it about 50 years after that.
This is really interesting because I think you have in different periods during the Mongol Empire and at different points in the Ottoman Empire, you have a lot of people living side by side. Muslims, Christians, Jews, different ethnic groups. And again, that's not to say that it was never contentious, but this idea that, if you're from a different tribe or you're a different religion, you can't live together in the same place. I think that's crazy. I mean, we know, we see evidence of that. And it does seem like Cyprus is still a bit of that of sorts, where it's like, those are, at the end of the day, you're fellow people. You could have maybe a different last name or maybe a different religion or whatever it is, but and so again, my optimism here is that people get along a little bit better than they hate each other. But again, that's not to say that people don't hate each other.
They do. I mean, what's often not very well understood in Anglo sources is that the Ottoman Empire for a long time had an official policy of religious tolerance. So it was actually a very good place to be Jewish, or we shouldn't kind of conflate tolerance with equality.
Sure.
Certainly, if you were a Muslim, you would get kind of tax breaks.
Certainly was Muslim. Yeah.
There were advantages to being Muslim, but there was no official persecution of Orthodox Christians in Cyprus.
So tell us, I guess, a little bit. We can kind of move more modern here. How did the British Empire get involved? As we mentioned earlier, they started to meddle, but how did?
Disraeli's grand scheme. Basically, what they really needed was they really wanted somewhere that would help to defend kind of critical infrastructure. So they had the Levant Company for a few hundred years, and it had been really, really good for them. They'd been, buying up currents from the Ottomans and selling them elsewhere. They had been buying up opium from the Ottomans and then selling it to the Chinese, and basically precipitating the Opium Wars. And this kind of maritime trade had become so important to the Brits that it basically dictated foreign policy. Kind of balance of power idea across the 19th century that you didn't want France to be too strong, you didn't want Russia to be too strong. And one of the things that Disraeli felt would help Britain to maintain its own empire, particularly the route to India, which was crucial, would be to get hold of Cyprus. It was really about protecting the route to India, the Suez Canal. It looked like strategically it was a really good idea. I mean, they then almost immediately kind of created their own little situation in Suez itself. And then that basically meant that Cyprus was, it kind of obviated the need for Cyprus. Gladstone comes in, doesn't really understand why they have it in the first place. And there's not really any official policy. They just haven't worked out what to do with it. So they don't really do anything because it's not officially theirs for about 20 years, 30 years. Or sorry, longer actually. And by the time it gets to World War I, they just think, well, we'd rather have Greece in the war. We don't really care about Cyprus. That big play doesn't really come to pass. And because they can dictate terms at the end of World War I, they take it officially as by right of conquest from the Ottomans. So once it becomes actually British, it's a kind of an official sort of colony rather than being held as a sort of protectorate for the Ottomans. Then they have to start forming a policy. Cypriots want self-determination. They want to be able to have some degree of autonomy over the way they're governed. And this comes to a head in 1931 when there's a huge riot. They burn down the governor's house. That goes terribly because for the next decade, they're basically stripped of almost all their sort of any civil rights that would have led towards more self-determination. And then after World War II, many Cypriots volunteer on the Allied side, but about 30,000 Cypriots, which, bearing in mind that the population of the island at the time is probably 700,000, it's a really significant proportion.
Yeah.
They're told to fight for Greece and freedom, so invoking their kind of Greek identity. And so they thought they would, many of them thought they would get one or the other. Enosis is this idea that, fundamentally the majority population is Greek in its culture and identity and language, and therefore there should be enosis or union with the greater state of Greece. So that was what many Greek Cypriots began agitating for, particularly in the 1950s, and it became a violent insurgency campaign against the British.
You mentioned that Cyprus gains independence in 1960, but not quite. How is that a misnomer? How does it? They're independent, but not. How do you understand it?
Yeah, so the idea of independence is kind of foisted upon the person who's leading the campaign for enosis or union. Initially, he thinks that it's just going to be kind of handed over to Greece in the way that the Ionian Islands were handed from the British straight to Greece. Because the Brits very effectively invoked the Turkish Cypriot. They said, well, surely Turkey, you object to the idea of them being part of Greece. And then, of course, having been invited to object, Turkey does object. And you see, this is the beginning of this kind of intercommunal conflict. And so it's seen to be unworkable, the idea of giving the island wholesale to Greece. So instead they say, okay, let's say we're going to give you independence. But it's the only country that's ever been denied self-determination, true self-determination, by its own constitution. The constitution was written for it by three what we'll call guarantor powers. So Greece, Turkey, and England, Britain. Each of them could intervene in the islands, militarily, if they felt that their constituency on the island was being threatened. They were only supposed to intervene in order to restore the status quo antebellum, so to restore the independence of the Republic of Cyprus. But it came with all these conditions, all of these ways that they were trying to kind of balance competing interests of Greek and Turkish Cypriots in government. The whole system pretty much from the start wasn't workable. So government broke down within 3 years. And it's not entirely surprising, partly because the people who were in conflict with one another in the 50s, the Turkish Cypriot representative who had been agitating for partition of the island became the vice president. The guy who had been saying he wanted union with Greece, who'd been fighting violently against the British, it was also the archbishop and the president of the island in 1960. So it probably wasn't entirely surprising that government didn't really work.
So yeah, you mentioned it, I guess, a little bit. You have this crisis in 63, 64, where, Turkey almost invades Cyprus. And as you mentioned, kind of in the 50s, definitely after, independence in 1960, there's this this is what starts kind of what we alluded to earlier, this Turkish-Greek kind of okay, I'm going to have it, I'm going to have it. What happened during the crisis and how did it get resolved? Ceasefire? what happened?
Yeah, it's arguably some version of the same conflict has been going on since kind of 1957, 58. So one of the things that the when I say Turkish, I mean, mainland Turkey. When I say Greek, I mean mainland Greek for clarity. So one of the things that once Turkey was invited to object, the government at a very high level in secret were working to basically prove, because it was in their interest to prove, that Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots couldn't get along. So one of the ways they did this was to, very similar to the Istanbul pogrom of Greeks in 1955, which was arguably related to the negotiations going on at the UN about Cyprus. In 1958, people who were aligned with Turkey set up a kind of false flag bombing of a Turkish information office so that they could blame it on the Greek Cypriots. There wasn't a huge amount of love lost. At this point, you basically see each of the communities become kind of captured by the most fearful, the kind of right-wing elements of each community. So it's Elga, the right-wing, violent paramilitary movement that's effectively running the show for the Greek Cypriots. And its counterpart is called TMT, which was doing pretty much the same thing, except they were agitating for different outcomes. So by the time you get to the 60s, there've been lots of clandestine shipments of weapons into Cyprus. Everyone's waiting for the first excuse, really, for a conflict. So it kicks off over what should have been a really minor exchange. Two Greek Cypriot auxiliary policemen stop a car late at night in Nicosia. There's a bit of an argument. There's a suggestion that in the back may have been a sex worker. Whatever happened, two Turkish Cypriot people were shot. And that kicks off a huge conflict. The important thing to remember at this time is that the whole island is like 80% Greek Cypriot, but within Nicosia, it's actually majority Turkish Cypriot. So initially there was, it gets complicated basically, but that was the kicking off point. And quite quickly, really by the end of Christmas, the UN has stepped in to try to create a kind of tentative ceasefire. And throughout the 60s, there are different powers that are agitating for completely different outcomes. It really doesn't help that in 1967 in Greece, there's a military coup and a fascist junta takes over. So it's the junta, really, their maddest one of all, called Ioannidis, who in 1974 decides he's going to commit to a coup d'etat to depose the elected Greek Cypriot President Pagadios in order to, I think, take over the island for Greece. It's a stupid idea, and it goes about as terribly as you would think it would go. And it's really in response to that Turkey invades from the north, and we end up with the kind of ceasefire line that we have today.
I was going to say, this is where 74 coup d'etat, that's where we have the current split of the island. Till today,
Yeah, it's pretty much how, and it's actually follows a line that was first really drawn in the 1950s by Turkish Cypriot organization that was advocating for partition. So this is something that had been in the minds of Turkish and Turkish Cypriot people for a while. So that was the precipitating event.
When you fast forward all the way up to 2004, they joined the EU, which is interesting.
Just the south, the Republic of Cyprus.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because Turkey is not part of the EU. That's right. So just the south. So isn't that weird? You have half the island is like European Union citizens, and then the other half isn't. That's very strange.
It's caused all kinds of problems. We've got so many casinos on the island because the north isn't really kind of regulated in much of any way. So there were casinos up there, and in order to reduce capital flight, they've had to have casinos in the south. There were huge kind of people smuggling operations between this quite porous boundary between North and South Cyprus. There was a lot of cigarette smuggling. It's a really weird. It's probably one of the most porous bits of the EU. and that's caused all kinds of problems.
Mm.
I think one of the reasons why we have per capita the highest rate of refugees on Cyprus
Mm.
is if you can get to Turkey, which isn't much of a problem.
Yeah.
You can get to North Cyprus. If you can get across the checkpoint, it's not even technically a border because the north isn't technically a country.
Mm-hmm.
So you just have to cross the checkpoint, somehow, and then you're in the EU.
Mm-hmm.
So there are all these little problems that persist to this day. The EU thing. So I didn't really answer your question, but the EU thing was supposed to bring Cyprus together. It was a plan by Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of UN, to sort of create a federated state. So two parts, but it was the same country.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to explain federated states to an American, sorry. So yeah, good.
We have an idea of that.
We know it can work, and so they
sort
cooperate.
Sort of works.
Stuff. Yeah, it works at times. So they would cooperate on a bunch of civil stuff, and then they would have their own kind of guarantees baked in. It was quite a good plan. The problem really for it was vote. So the Turkish Cypriots in the north voted yes. They wanted to proceed with reunification, and the majority Greek Cypriot population in the south voted no. So the kind of cynical argument would be that by saying no, they still get to join the EU because they're the bit that's the official state. And then as an EU member, they can hold as leverage their EU membership. They have the power of veto for any new members. So they can hold over Turkey the idea that they're going to veto their membership to the EU. So that would be the cynical argument. I think there is one of the good reasons why Greek Cypriots voted in the main against reunification was that there wasn't really a provision for drawdown of Turkish troops. So it is kind of unthinkable, really, the idea that you would have a sovereign nation that was just militarily occupied by a completely different sovereign state. It's not a good long-term solution to anything. So I do think that was probably a reasonable objection, but obviously it'd taken tens of years of negotiating to get to that point. So sometimes the perfect is the enemy of the good. The irony of the whole thing was that those who had voted for reunification in the north didn't get EU membership because their legal status was not resolved because it's the sort of right of territory by an illegal invasion according to the UN. And the South, which voted against reunification, did get EU membership. So I think for many in the North, that's felt like a bitter irony.
Yeah. So the current state is from what I understand, is that you have the north part of the island is Turkish Cypriot. Then you have not quite in the middle, but basically the capital of Nicosia, and there's all of these. There are two at the north end, north end and south end, I guess. These UN buffer zones, and then you have a few bases from the United Kingdom on the south side of the island, and then the whole southern part of the island is Greek in Cyprus, and that's where Paphos is and things like that. So you do have Nicosia that is. Is this too fine of a point to say? Is it like old Berlin? You have east west, the whole thing.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
I mean, it is literally. There's a physical barrier that it's patrolled. There are guards with live ammunition. It's a stagnant conflict, but there are people who, in kind of horribly recent memory, there are people who have died trying to sort of cross or to. In the 90s, someone climbed a flagpole to try to take down a Turkish flag. A Greek Cypriot tried to take one down, and while he was climbing the flagpole, he was shot. And some UN or British soldiers who were trying to de-escalate the conflict were also shot. So
tense.
Yeah, I mean it's still a proper a kind of live issue for the people who live there.
What do you I guess in writing the book and all these things, what do you think is the future, I guess, of Cyprus? In terms of, will there be kind of unification, or will it, whatever that looks like? And then I guess just more generally, I mean, how do you see, outside of the kind of dicey politics of it, or nationalism or things like that. I mean, how do you see the islands, really thriving and being able to, kind of come into its own in some ways more than it already has? But yeah, what do you see as the future of, Cyprus and Cypriots?
It's so I think in the short term it is hard to see a really clear path to reunification, because particularly the north is currently run by their leader Tatar is very aligned with Erdogan, who I think they feel they have a vested interest in keeping the island divided. So I don't think there's going to be a kind of quick diplomatic solution. I think that's probably, it would be lovely, but I don't think it's realistic. What I do think is important, is going to be hopefully increasingly important in the coming years, is if we can do things like this. The book is part of, I think, a wider project of Cypriots to try to tell their own story in a way that's kind of self-coherent and that integrates the sense of Turkish Cypriot identity and Greek Cypriot identity, and these other small communities that also inhabit the island. There are Maronites, there are Armenians, and increasingly there are Israelis living in Cyprus. There's a growing Russian and Ukrainian population. So we need to tell a version of our story that makes sense to ourselves first, that kind of unifies our sense of identity. And once we've done that, I think it will be much easier to generate a political solution. It's a weird time for the country, because I think it's, as I say, there are all these kind of weird issues that are sort of secondary problems created by the stagnant territorial conflict. But also it's trying to kind of find its way economically. One of the things it's done was to really commit to mass tourism, and it's, places like Ayia Napa are these massive tourist traps now that I think the Cypriots are kind of pulling back from it a bit and trying to say, okay, maybe we should be aiming to be a bit more luxury and a bit less mass tourism. One of the other ways was to try to financialize the economy and to do financial services. London's very good at that, to the extent that it got dubbed Londongrad, because it was enabling so many oligarchs. And I think that's one of the dangers of financializing your economy, is that you become reliant on people who've got a lot of money they need to move. So without kind of getting myself in legal hot water, I think you've got to worry. Certainly, the U.S. State Department gets very worried about financial corruption in Cyprus.
Yeah, for sure.
So those are some of the challenges, but I think is all, you can overcome all of that stuff. That's kind of things. Those things will pass too. I think the thing that's really important for Cyprus is to kind of maintain a sense of itself and to be proud of its history. It's got an amazing history, and it needs to get better at telling its own story.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Alex, this was a lot of fun. I enjoyed your book a lot. I really loved the conversation with you and talking about the island, the people, the culture, the history. It's definitely a place I really want to go. And it sounds wonderful. Despite all some of these more recent conflictual things. Wow, what a rich, deep history. It sounds absolutely gorgeous. So I really, really appreciate you coming on and talking all about it. It's been fabulous.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure.
Absolutely.